We are broken, shattered people because of all the suffering which exists within our world right now. I found myself wrestling with God recently because of all the suffering we are experiencing as a family. To lose a loved one isn't easy. To be given bad news from the doctor isn't easy on us. And somehow we are just expected to live through this pain and to survive it. But that pain and that suffering is so unbearable. And even though it is not the right thing to do, and I often feel very guilty in doing it, but blaming God and fighting with Him isn't the answer. Rather, trusting in Him to pull us through this is what we need to do. But it's not always easy. We have one thing after the other, one bad thing after the other. As they say, it comes in threes. First someone passes, then someone receives bad news from the doctors, then there's more tragedy on top of that, and more and more and more. Just as we feel like we somehow manage to get through the first process of pain and of mourning and begin to accept that someone is no longer there, then another bad thing happens to us, and then another one after that. It just doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair that bad things happen to good people. This has been my fight with God for the past couple of days, but instead of me distancing myself from Him, it also just had brought me closer to Him, perhaps closer in the sense of me speaking more openly with Him about this pain and questioning Him as well and fighting with Him, but still I trust in Him and I trust in His plan and in His purpose for our lives. Still I have faith that though we may not see clearly right now, that in the greater scheme of things, even as the pain and the suffering remains with us and leaves a void in our lives for the longest time, that we will get through this. It feels to me today that this reading, particularly from the Gospel according to St. Matthew today, speaks very clearly to each of us. Very often we are unforgiving toward others, but very often we are unforgiving toward God as well. And sometimes we don't understand why certain things happen, and sometimes the evil which exists in our world results in us suffering and experiencing pain, and we shift that blame onto God, and we go through something very traumatic and we blame God, and something else happens and we continue to blame and fight against Him. Rather, as Jesus says, we should forgive one another and to continue granting mercy for one another, but also in the same way that we should forgive God and to not blame Him or to not fight with Him, but rather in our distress to be drawn nearer to Him. Often these trials, this pain and this suffering molds and builds us and creates within our own lives a story to tell, but also to impact and influence the life of someone else. This pain and the suffering does not only give us the opportunity to draw closer to the Father, but also through this pain and eventual healing to draw others nearer to Him as well. But as I mentioned, it is difficult. It's a difficult process. We go through this pain. We go through these traumatic experiences. And today it is also so fitting that we celebrate the life of Saint Jane Frances de Chantal, who was also struck by tragedy when her husband was killed in a hunting accident, and she was left a widow at just the age of 28 years old, and she found it nearly impossible to forgive the man who had caused her husband's death, and the grief and the anger consumed her, as it often does us as well. But she heard a homily which changed her life. And what that bishop might have preached is not relevant right now, but through that sermon, God spoke to her. And in the same way, through our pain, though it is difficult, though it is traumatic, He also speaks to you and me. Jane de Chantal eventually managed to move beyond her pain and her trauma. It took time, it was a process, and she eventually joined the convent and she became a nun, and she founded the Congregation of the Visitation in the 1600s, and welcoming religious sisters who were very often unwelcomed in other religious congregations due to illness or age or the inability to live the strict life which most convents required. Then in another story in our recent times, Nightbird, you You might recall Nightbird, who is a Golden Buzzer singer who recently appeared on America's Got Talent, has also shared her struggle and her pain as she fights through cancer. And the cancer, unfortunately, has affected her life so drastically again that she needed to step down from the competition. But she too speaks of her trauma and of her pain as she was diagnosed with cancer, and soon after her husband left her and she was all alone, and she felt this emptiness in her life. And she blogs much of her experience of spending many of her days and nights lying on the bathroom floor, throwing up and feeling weak and having that fight with God. She wrote that she had cancer 3 times and she had barely passed the age of 30, and admits that there are times when she wonders what she must have done to deserve such pain. But through all of that pain and suffering, she writes on her blog that she is God's downstairs neighbor. She speaks of how she has a fight with God, how she sings songs of praise to Him and she apologizes to Him, but always she speaks to Him. And even through the difficulty, she trusts in Him. She writes that she had felt God's sadness as well, that though unexplainable at the fact that she needed to suffer the way that she did, that she still feels chosen, she still feels blessed, she still feels loved by God, even through all the pain and all the suffering. Now, my friend, I know it is difficult. I know it's not easy to keep the faith, and sometimes in keeping to trust God, and one bad thing comes after the next. But let us just find comfort in the lives of these extraordinary women who had also experienced pain and excruciating suffering. And one thing they showed is that they continued to trust God, continued to converse with Him, and sometimes in anger because of the pain, but they continued to communicate with Him as well. Let us learn to put down our sticks, to take off those boxing gloves, and to trust and to have faith that this pain will heal in time, that we will be restored, and that we will have mercy shown upon us, and that one day we will find that joy again. But it takes time. It takes time. The process is difficult. The pain is there for a long, long time. God love you, and may He love your family and grant to you the grace and the peace and the consolation and the strength to get through this difficult time. May we learn to trust in Him, to have faith in His plan, and though we may not have the answers right now, may we one day be filled with wisdom to know that things will get better, that we will get better, that we will heal, and that we will rise again. Amen.